Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and dear colleagues. I am privileged to be here due to the good offices and patience of Professor Callaos, and I am also privileged that a fellow Austrian is chairing this session, Professor Müller. We have never got to know each other, although he lives 2 districts away from where I live in Vienna. So it's a privilege to be here just to encounter you at Orlando in Florida. In a recent symposium in Harvard, the chairman opened it and said, who has never heard of Schumpeter? And of course in Harvard it's a brand name, so no hands went up. And then he said, dare you anyway. And my presentation will be a systems-related presentation of Schumpeter's very seminal book in 1912. Where do we have to off again? Oh, yeah. Don't worry, it's not a lecture in German or in Latin, but I just want to show the very first issue of his seminal book on the theory of economic development, Theorie der wirtschaftlichen Entwicklung, and it also shows what he was. In fact, not an economist, but he graduated in Vienna as a lawyer. He also practiced law for one and a half years in Egypt with British privilege, and made some good money there with some princesses. He also had his motto, HYPOTHESES non FINGO, and that simply wants to bring home, although it's a theory, but you just have to look around, and economic life, the economy works like that, as I'm trying to describe. It never shows up in the following reprints or in the following issues of the same book. And I want to point out that my presentation refers essentially to 3 systems-related major publications of Schumpeter's. It's Theory of Economic Development, translated, translated 1934, 22 years after it was first published in German, and published then in Harvard. And you see the difference too. There's no motto anymore. And there's a cumbersome subtitle which he added in the second edition, 1926, the German edition in 1926, and wanted to bring home that this is a theory and not a history, as some people misinterpreted his first editions on inquiry into profits, capital, credit, interest, and the business cycle. Not much of the business cycle in this one. And the business cycle, then he published in 1939 in Harvard, 1,000 pages, something like that, which brings it home. It's considered to be the empirical part to the theory itself, his business cycles in 1939. And then the third one is, of course, possibly his most popular publication on the capitalism, socialism, and democracy. A word on his sort of more personal background. He had 2 self-proclaimed ambitions in life: to be the best lover, to be the best horseback rider, and the best economist in the world. As to the latter, I think there's something to it. he became the first non-American born president of the American Economic Association in 1948. Still worthwhile to read his presidential address on science and technology. And he, a year later, was the first elected president of the International Society, of Society of International Development, was founded in France, in Paris, but he died in early 1950, unexpectedly in Harvard, before he could take on the presidency of this organization. So he had some reputation and possibly some credit to his third ambition in life. There's a short bio in Harvard, too, about Schumpeter's life, a little bit tongue-in-cheek. He graduated as a lawyer in Vienna, became a professor, then went into politics and failed. He was the first finance minister after the First World War in Vienna, but he was very arrogant and he resigned, but in fact he was fired after 7 months, and became a banker's license, and the bank went broke in 2 years, 2 to 3 years. And then he returned to academia, went to Germany. In fact, he became professor in Bonn, where he sort of started to work on the business cycles. And then went to Harvard and turned left. The letter was due to his publication on capitalism, socialism, and democracy, with the provocative sentences at the beginning of the chapter on capitalism, and the first sentence at the beginning of the chapter on socialism. And you probably know it, widely cited. Can capitalism survive? No, I don't think so. Can socialism work? Yes, I think it can. And then follows, if you read the chapter on socialism, the most cynical, devastating criticism on the socialist system as it emerged in the Soviet Union, that it only could work if the nomenclatura would behave in a way which it didn't and couldn't. Due to the system, it couldn't. If it would behave, we would say, ideally. So in 1942, when it was published, I maintain it is the first systems-related predicament of the demise and the breakdown finally in 1989 of the Soviet system. This was in the chapter of socialism. You can also sometimes use it as a teaser and ask something, do you know capitalism, socialism? And yes, I know. Have you read it? Yes, I've read it. And then what's the first chapter? Of course, it's capitalism. No, it's on Marx, as you know. And Marx was kind of an inspiration for Schumpeter and his systems-related interpretation of economic life. I read one quote, and it's in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, and he says, the only major attempt toward the problem of development is the one of Karl Marx. He strived to treat the development of economic life, that's a typical Schumpeterian term, on basis of economic theory. His accumulation principle, his immiserization principle, his crisis theories following from that testify to the knowledge of pure economic reasoning. So much Schumpeter, and then he took it on and developed systems-related anti-Marxist defense of a market-based system of capitalism, if you want to say so. And let me just characterize this attempt as it took shape in 1912 in his seminal first version, very bold version of interpreting capitalist development, therefore theory of economic development. And as a counter point, the Marxist view of economic or social development. And in both cases, it's of course a systems-related dialectics. As you may know, Marx, in the first book of the Capital, he says, production, or let's say the economic process is under all circumstances, at any time and anywhere, a social process, a systems-based social process. Therefore, no individual competition, therefore, in consequences, no markets as we know it in market-based systems, and an embeddedness of the process without any equilibrium, as economic theory in neoclassical terms pretended that they would exist. No equilibrium on the way in the context of his interpretation of historic materialism. And we also know that in this process, Marx needed a systems change, a fundamental systems change from feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and then communism, which was a future utopia in his historic materialism. And Schumpeter took this on. Schumpeter took it on in defense of, let's say, the existing market-based capitalist system as it was known. And there comes a very bold stroke of his own. We know the thesis, as I mentioned, the socio-economic process. Schumpeter makes it more down to earth and says, well, we have the market system, so let's live with it. The market is there, and that's the thesis. In Marx, the antithesis of driving the system is, of course, that in capitalism, we do have private ownership of the means of production. That's the antithesis of Marx, driving at the same time in a dialectic way the system to the next stage, or the next system, could say. Schumpeter then takes a different approach, an overwhelmingly bold approach, that the antithesis of the market system is the entrepreneur. It's the entrepreneur taking center stage in governing the dynamics of economic life in capitalism. And if we look around, then I think he has a point, systems-related point, to say that an entrepreneur in the Schumpeterian sense doesn't want competition. He cannot escape the markets, but for a time, the Schumpeterian entrepreneur in a systems-related meaning strives to create a niche of his own, or, more brutally speaking, to be, if possible, a monopolist. And in doing so, of course, this has its price as well. That's the famous or infamous creative destruction, which he coined not in the theory book, but this term was coined in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. So the entrepreneur, the entrepreneurially driven system is the antithesis in capitalist development. And Schumpeter, in doing so, doesn't need a systems change. Doesn't need a systems change from capitalism to socialism, as Marx interpreted it. And the third is, of course, the synthesis. In the Marxian system, or the Marxist view, the synthesis is the new system. So the synthesis going, the socio-economic development from capitalism to socialism is socialism, where the ownership, private ownership of the means of production is abolished. And the classes, to some extent as well, there are two classes still, of course. And in Schumpeterian terms, that's more tricky, I would say, and he struggled with that, but there is a synthesis as well. And his synthesis is, in capitalism, due to the entrepreneurially driven dynamics of capitalism, we reach a higher level of welfare. So this higher level of welfare is created, and as I said before, through value, entrepreneurially driven value creation. That's the Schumpeterian idea of the synthesis. But there is no equilibrium. And Schumpeter took on his peers in Vienna as well, the neoclassicists like Menger, Böhm-Bawerk, and Friedrich Wieser. They didn't like him for that too much, but still Böhm-Bawerk supported him. Not in his theory, but in his professional life. Schumpeter also then created, in the second edition, the 5 cases which are well known, which I think are superfluous and, in fact, distract from the systems-related interpretation of the capitalist or market-based development. Famous 5 cases, so people took it, page 100 in the German 1926 version, the 5, he calls it really Fälle, it's a very strange term, in fact points, or page 66 in the English translation of 1934. And think this is the description, the characteristic of the Schumpeterian entrepreneur. It's of course not, because the Schumpeterian entrepreneur is a systems-based animal. You could say this is much, much richer than these 5 somewhat strangled points of interpreting what Schumpeterian entrepreneur really is. Let me conclude with a typical neoclassical interpretation of Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk of capitalism and anti-Marxist interpretation of capitalism itself. It's something of a notion which Schumpeter took on and dynamized it. This is, if you take the curve, the typical neoclassical production function, Douglas type production function, and at each point there's an equilibrium, which Schumpeter said there is no equilibrium. Each point the equilibrium, and the tangent, as it is defined, defines the stage of capitalist development. Böhm-Bawerk argues in 1889 the positive theory of capital, so a typical anti-Marxist title already, very, very provocative, very famous, and still the core of neoclassical production function, capital theory, based on the neoclassical production function, the roundabout way of production. So if you see the tangent moving, if you see capitalism moving along the production function, out then, let's say, the cut-off point at the left side of the axis moves out, way out, way out. And the argument against Marx of And so we wouldn't need Marx, that he would say. The argument is a typical neoclassical marginal utility argument. And it says, we are so far out that we can say, quantitatively too, that the addition in capitalism, in mature capitalism, of any additional unit of capital approaches the value of zero. And this is the reinterpretation, ingenious reinterpretation of Knut Wicksell, the Swedish, famous Swedish economist at the time, and taking simply the investment function, flows and cost and flow diagrams, then you get the formula 2 divided by infinity. So that's approaching zero. That's lying way out in the asymptotic picture of Böhm-Bawerk. And now comes the twist. This is systems-related twist, which was sort of an inspiration for Schumpeter himself. That if this is the case in mature capitalism, and if each additional unit in the system approaches the value of zero, then we don't have to talk anymore of the private ownership of the means of production, and capitalism itself can abolish the classes. Sort of wouldn't be because of that, of the inner development, systems-related inner development of a market-based capitalist system, the strengths to do away with classes, as Marx interpreted it. So this was Böhm-Bawerk's early but static approach. And Schumpeter took this on and interpreted until today dynamically. And the legacy still is there, not only in Harvard, but all around. If you just take The Economist every week, there is, since a couple of years now, a chapter entitled Schumpeter, with various interpretations of economic issues, contemporary problems in economics and so on. So that's one of the legacy. The other one, more theoretical, is if we talk of endogenous economic development, Schumpeter delivered the first interpretation of endogenous economic development in his theory of economic development itself. And there would be other examples still to mention, but let me close here and thank you very much for being here.